someone in your life who maybe they're going through a period of doubt, or maybe they've never really thought about things, but they kind of have the easy answers to what is life about, or who is God and why should that matter to me? Or maybe you're going through a period of time where you've got doubts and questions, but you just can't seem to find anybody to talk to because you're going to end up getting preached at or judged because you're simply asking questions. You're trying to sort things out. Well, today on Life Talks, I want to talk about how do we engage with people who may be going through doubt, who are engaging or who are skeptical, or who may flat out are agnostics. An atheist believes there is no God, and will say it very authoritatively. And that agnostic says that I don't think there is a God, or if there is a God, he's not relevant to me, or
like I'm not sure if there is a God, kind of a thing. Like there's less certainty to it a lot of times when they're using that label.
Absolutely. So my name is Dan. I'm one of the teaching pastors in Cornelius, North Carolina at Life Fellowship, and I'm joined today with our co-host and executive producer, Josh Brahm. And Josh, I know in your ministry and your work, you often are engaging with people who are pretty bright intellectually, who are searching, they're deeper thinkers, and then you also find a few that just like to argue, and those are always fun too, particularly on college campuses. They would debate over what favorite icing should be on a cake or something. They just enjoy that. But I chose this topic because of your presence on this
okay.
This podcast.
No pressure.
No pressure at all. But you probably as much as anybody I know are regularly engaging agnostics, even atheists or self-proclaimed atheists, skeptics, or people who are just asking the deeper questions. Yeah. And so what do we do? Well, we're going to try to talk about that a little bit today. Josh, just remind our audience about some of the things that you do as it relates to this.
Yeah, so I run a nonprofit called Equal Rights Institute, and we say we try to help pro-life people to be less weird and more like Jesus. And a big part of that is being relational. I was explaining to someone actually this morning. It's like we kind of like operate on two ends of a spectrum, and one of them is relevant to today. One would be like the philosophy end. I really hate bad arguments, so I want to help people with philosophy, but I really care about I want to help us be more relational and be friends with people who are different from us. So pro-life people should be friends with pro-choice people. Christians should be friends with agnostics, and atheists. Our friends should not all think like us, look like us. We should be having relationships where we can have, like, in the context of that relationship, it's a genuine friendship. I think this is what Christians like maybe get confused the most often when we think about this, is like we get into this mindset where we're like, okay, yeah, they're my friend, but like they're my friend so that I can change their mind about X, Y, and Z and help them be better. And that sometimes doesn't end up being a genuine friendship. So when I talk about relational apologetics, I mean genuine friendship. And within that context, sometimes you can talk about important, serious issues.
You know, Ben, who used to be the co-host of this podcast, had a saying often. He would challenge people. He said, "Don't look at others as if they're projects.
Yes.
Remember that they are people too." Yes. And I think a lot of times, the thing about Christian community is the longer we're a Christian, the more insulated we become.
Yes.
Our friendships shift. Our community is the body of believers or local churches. Get smaller and smaller. So not only do we not know people who may not know Christ, but we don't know how they think. We get shocked at some of their bold statements and their bald doubt.
Yeah.
And so before we kind of get into how we engage, what are some things that we probably ought to avoid?
Oh, boy. Okay, so like really big thing that everyone should avoid right now. I know I harp on this a lot on this podcast, but confirmation bias, like it's just a big thing. Like if you are only paying attention to the Daily Wire or Fox News, or if you're on the other side and only listen to MSNBC or a Sam Cedar or Sam Harris or people like that, you are in confirmation bias land, and you need to be listening to groups on both, so smart people on both sides, not just like dumb memes like from the other side, and then like brilliant like articles from your side. Like it's got to be kind of even. So we need to avoid confirmation bias. Try to use kind of neutral language. I think this can be really helpful. Like remember that people, like when people, and this is all of us, but when people are confronted with evidence of some view that is not their own, our brains go into self-defense mode. Like we have these biases, these cognitive biases where we are trying to block ourselves from believing that thing. So remember that when you're trying to get other people to think a certain way, that they may be coming from a different perspective, and they're going to be on defense as soon as they start reading this thing, because they're on the other side. And so try to use neutral language, try to use friendly language. Don't be all like, just be using labels and names. It's just so much dehumanizing rhetoric that happens. And when it comes from Christians, that's really bad.
Yeah. And I would also say, again, going back to Ben's quote and so forth, is we got to see our conversations as more than a part of our job or an extension of the Great Commission. We talk about the Great Commission, but the Great Commandment is to love them, with all your as you would yourself.
Yes.
And so, with that in mind, I think that for a while in evangelicalism, I'm rant a little bit, but
I want to hear it.
We were told to sell the gospel like it was a multi-level marketing plan.
Yeah.
In fact, I heard some of this in evangelism classes say, well, if everybody would win one person to Christ every year, and if the next year each person won another person to Christ, the next year, that in 30 years we would have 20 million people, and in 50 years the entire world would be believers, and like that could happen.
Exponential. As if you're going to see every single year, every single Christian is going to see someone come into the faith. Like that's completely.
So but that in sales, that's how they sell it, in multi-level marketing and so forth.
Yeah.
And I think
always be closing. You don't want that to be the evangelist mindset, to always be closing.
Yeah. And it's not up to you whether someone trusts Christ or not. Anyway, that's a work of the Spirit.
Yeah.
And depending on what degree of a Calvinist you are, there's other implications doctrinally on that. But I think that kind of comes to my first point is we need to listen first.
Yes.
We listen first, and to build a relationship with someone.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is crass, I think, to go into any kind of friendship and a relationship with the ulterior motive that I need another salvation notch in my belt.
Yes.
I think as believers everywhere we go, we ought to be going forth weeping, bearing precious seeds, as the Scripture said.
Yeah.
But I think also, before Jesus started talking to the woman at the well about the fact that she had been married multiple times and was living with a dude, he started off with a conversation about water.
Yeah.
He treated her as a person when others would not have treated her as a person.
Yeah, which was a big deal at that time.
Yeah, he was a rabbi talking to a woman. He was a Jew talking to a Samaritan, which was a half-breed.
Right.
And he was a moral, upright person who was talking to a woman who was a serial married woman.
Right.
And so we have to build that bridge that across which we present the gospel eventually. But it does take listening.
Yeah.
Listening. And you can describe that sometimes whenever you're out talking on college campuses and so forth. How do you process that?
So I think the common mistake that people make with listening is like we're always like we're working in our minds. We have this inner monologue going on of what is the next, chess move that I'm going to make.
Oh, that's a perfect illustration.
Once they finish, there's a great quote from Pulp Fiction. Well, I remember it. It was, are you listening or are you waiting to talk? And he's like, oh man, that is so good. We are so often just waiting to talk. We are not actually listening. And we might be kind of hearing them, but we're not truly listening to them. And so what I try to do is I try to turn that monologue off. I try to silence it. And this is really hard. This might be like, of all the dialogue tips I teach, this might still be the hardest one to really be faithful with, is because we feel so much pressure sometimes to defend our view, defend Christianity, defend whatever. But then they're saying these really important things that are either, maybe intellectual, maybe just really emotionally volatile or powerful or impactful. And we're just kind of in our heads thinking about what we're going to do next, what we're going to say next. And they can tell, and that's not real listening. And so, and since we kind of made fun of you last time, I'll make fun of me as a bad husband. We made fun of you a little bit for your funny husband-wife story last time, which is the best story I've ever heard on this podcast. I will give a quick kind of a story pointing the fingers at myself. I developed this dumb husband habit for a while where I would get home from work I was working at an office at the time. I'd get home and I'd be, I just kind of like set to like, as soon as I would get in, the kids would want to play like lightsaber battles or whatever we were into at the time. And there's a rule like Dad's going to go talk to Mom first. Mom matters most kind of a thing,
Absolutely.
So I went in there. She might be making dinner or whatever, and we'd be talking and just talking about our days. But she'd be talking, and I would be scrolling Facebook on my phone,
not giving her attention.
Right, and now I can feel the sonic boom from all of the everyone right now that is like exclaim, oh my God, the judgment I can feel. Judge not lest ye be judged. Here's the thing: I thought I was listening because I could tell that she was talking, right, and I could kind of follow the themes. But as soon as she would ask me like a comprehension question, I'd fail.
You're in trouble.
I'd fail. And she'd be frustrated, as she should have been. Like, that was not a good way to love my wife, right? And so I had to, and here's the point, is whenever I tell this story, everyone's like, oh yeah, you totally don't do that. But we all think that we can get into a philosophically difficult or emotionally difficult topic, whether it's abortion or Christianity or anything right now. And we think that we can have this like inner monologue going on planning our next move. And it's like, no, we can't. We've got to turn that off, just be present in the moment with this person. And it is okay if that means that you don't have a quick answer to their question or a witty comeback. You should probably be avoiding witty comebacks anyway.
Yep.
But like, that's okay. Let there be a beat, let there be a pause, and let them see that you're listening, because it's good for you to listen. It's better for them to know that you're listening.
Yeah. That's one of the techniques I use when I'm doing marriage counseling is I'll say, what is something that he's doing or she's doing that irritate you? And they'll start. And the other person hearing that says, I'm going to get my chance. And so they're immediately thinking about their response. And so then I said, now, before you answer that question, what did you just hear your husband or your wife say?
Yeah.
The look of terror that comes on their face at that moment when they realize, oh, I was supposed to be listening.
I thought I was just preparing my venting session. Right.
I remember my oldest daughter, Megan, when she was little, she'd yak. She just talked all the time. And she'd crawl up in my chair with me while I was, unwinding from work. And one day she's talking, and I'm yeah, sweet. Oh, that's wonderful. And she reaches up and she takes her little chubby hands and puts them on either side of my cheeks and on my face, and she pulls my head over and she goes, Daddy, I'm talking to you.
Oh,
she knew I was dialing it in. She knew I wasn't serious. And that was, here we are 30 some odd years later, and I still remember it with guilt. But
and we still struggle with that. Like we still it's not just kids. Like every generation getting together, family get-togethers. Every generation will sometimes be kind of locked on the phone sometimes, and it's very understandable. I've been listening to some of the recent Jonathan Haidt stuff. He just came out with a new book, The Anxious Generation, that I haven't read yet, but it sounds amazing, and I kind of generally agree with a lot of his take. And he just has a very strong view that if you look at psychological data from the early 2010s, like iPhones coming out, like a device that you can just tap on and get instant feedback. As soon as you give that to someone, that is now the most interesting thing that they have, right? And so that is just going to be an issue.
Yeah. This is probably the most difficult generation to allow for a focused conversation we've ever had.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So one of the other things that, and I'll keep quoting Ben today for some reason.
Yeah, I love it. Well, Ben was so good at this.
Yeah.
Ben was so at not just evangelism, but just like a relational version of evangelism. We were just so on the same wavelength about the way so we could quote Ben all day.
Yes, we could. He used this little outline for evangelism that was BLESS. He called it the BLESS outline. And I don't think it was unique to him, but it begins with prayer. Then secondly, you listen or learn, which we just talked about. Then the third thing was exercise or eat. And the fourth thing was serve. And so exercising together, eating together, serving together, or serving someone is all part of the process before you share your story.
Yeah.
And it may be 5 conversations in, 10 conversations in, but you make sure you do those things. So demonstrating Christ's love, demonstrating genuine interest in the person, listening and serving them are, to me, essential parts in it. Because a lot of times, the opinion of a lot of people is that Christians are here to pick your pocket, or it is transactional. As long as you think like me, we can be friends. But if you don't think like me, we can't be friends.
Right.
And so it's a very transactional thing.
Yeah.
And so let's say you're having a conversation on a college campus and so forth, and you've got some little question or some tool that you use to begin the question. How can you demonstrate Christ's love? How can you show the serving side, the interested side to them?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think part of what I'm trying to do is be really obviously empathetic while they're speaking. I want it to be really obvious to them that while maybe they thought that they were going to start venting at, some apologist that wasn't going to listen to them, or was just going to like be waiting to talk like most people are, that at some point they're like, wow, like this has really changed. We might have to make this a bunch of parts, because like I've got another story that I can tell on this. I was at Pasadena City College a long time ago, doing a pro-life display, and I could see her coming from across the plaza. She was yelling at me from probably like 50 yards away, and then all the way up. Like the volume was going up on the mixer, kind of a thing. She was with, I think, her partner, her lesbian partner, and she just had a lot of anger and contempt for what we were doing, and so I just kind of took it for a while. I was a more argumentative person then than I am now, but thankfully, like the Holy Spirit must have been speaking in my life at the time or whatever, because I had enough wisdom in that day to not argue with her. Not because it would have been hard to argue with her. She wasn't making very good arguments. That wasn't the point. The point was like, for some reason I could just tell that's not what she needs right now. She needed someone to just love her. And this is like what we say, like our goal is in the conversation is not to make them pro-life or to make them a Christian, it's just to love them. And that's complicated because people are complicated, and what they need on different days are different things. And so what does she need this? Like at that moment, she did not need a pro-life argument. She needed, as I came to realize, she needed there to be a Christian man or a pro-life man who would care about her, because as she eventually could tell on my face that I really cared about her. And like all of my body language. Someone took a picture of this because there's an outrage. So there's a picture of this, and I look really sad. And I am, because she's eventually opened up to me about how like her stepdad was abusive as a teenager, and like all these things that became like, oh my gosh, like of course she had so much anger in it. But of course it kind of like eventually those walls came down. I didn't really make any pro-life arguments because, again, I didn't feel like that's what she needed. I jumped in the one time when she was like, you all want to kill abortion doctors. And I'm like, no. I need you to know we're pro-life. That kind of thing. But besides, I just listened. I was just tilling soil, if we go to that parable. And then after, at the end of the conversation, and it really cool, this guy walked up just selling chocolate bars. He had bought a bunch of chocolate bars. He's like selling them for a profit. And I was just not interested. It was like Pasadena in the summer. Like, I don't buy chocolate bars right now. So she thought I was being cheap, but she offered to buy them for me. And I was like, that would have been totally different reaction if I had been like ready for bear. I was like, let's do this as she came up. But after that, I look like 20 minutes later, I look over, or maybe it actually might have been an hour or two later, but I looked over and she was talking to a friend of mine named Steve, who's a wonderful pro-life advocate, and they were having an actual more kind of deep conversation. So I think she needed this thing to happen first, and then it was fine that someone else maybe got to do actual seed planting.
Yeah. And so often we're trying to run ahead of the Holy Spirit. Like we could convince anybody.
Yeah.
And we can't. That is a spiritual work. But what we can do is till the soil.
Yes.
And prepare the way. One of the best ways I've seen to do that is by listening and asking questions. Like there was a guy I was talking to, and I knew he wasn't a believer. There was no indication along, but somebody we both knew. He told me that had passed away, and I hadn't known that, and it hit me kind of hard at the moment. And I said, "Wow, I didn't see that coming. I didn't really realize that," and it was kind of an emotionally connected moment because we were both mourning the same person that was dead. And so I kind of looked at him and I said, I don't know what religion you are. I don't know what do you think happens after we die? And if I had asked him in any other context that question, he would have braced himself.
Yeah.
And like, uh-oh, here comes.
Yeah.
But I asked him the question and found him giving me answers that both he and I, once he said them, were not good answers. On the other side of me, I went through this phase in life where I fancied apologetics.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to set them up so I could fix them, or I could show them, or quite frankly, I could embarrass them with their shallowness.
Yeah.
And the difference in response from someone who would ask genuine questions as opposed to someone, who walked around like a 40-pound rat saying, "Here, kitty, kitty, kitty." We're looking for somebody to humiliate, but that's kind of how I was. I was kind of like, I was pretty impressed with myself.
Yeah.
I knew these good arguments, and I'm just looking for someone to slay.
These people are still out there. It's less subtle now. Like people can kind of see it ahead of time now.
But Zig Ziglar used to say, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Yeah.
And as cliche as that is today, it is still very, very true. Yeah. And I'd like to think, I'm hopefully smarter than the average bear.
Yeah, you are.
But that doesn't impress anybody. In fact, you're more likely to
turn them off.
You come off obnoxious and arrogant.
Yep.
But, people like to tell you their opinions. People like to talk about themselves. People, I love surveys. I got this little thing I get in an email. It said, take a survey. And every time I take a survey, I get points. And I earn like $200 a year just doing that on my phone. Because I like to give my opinion. I know that shocks everybody. But
I know. Shocking.
But when you can have a generous and friendly conversation and slip in questions that are there to provoke thought, and you don't have to finish the conversation there. You may pick it up later on.
Yeah.
But as soon as a person starts feeling like, he's got an agenda, you pretty well ruined the conversation.
Yeah.
And that's one of my concerns about apologetics. Our church has always had a bit of an emphasis, more so in the past than we do now, on apologetics.
Yes.
But really, there's a very small portion of the world who respond flatly to apologetic strategies.
Yeah. Or at least depends on the apologetic style. Like there's some apologetic styles that are very combative, very like, we're going to get them like doing all the work. We're going to embarrass them. We're going to show them how much smarter that we are. And it just comes about, and sometimes it turns into just learning how to defend your current view, as opposed to like philosophy where, like, this isn't like some people use apologetics this way, but it's like in philosophy, generally speaking, it's more like we're just going to try to think well. It's not about trying to defend a certain view. We just want to think well about all the views and do our best to figure out what views we currently have that are wrong. The one thing I say about asking questions, I completely agree. I agree with everything you said. Like, asking questions is so important. We don't actually know what other people think, so we've got to find out. So ask a lot of clarification questions. A distinction that we make at Equal Rights Institute is to avoid a certain kind of question that we call an argument that ends with a question mark. Some questions are really just arguments that end with question marks. So like an example from another apologist would be like, so it seems like if there's a big bang, if there was a big bang, then wouldn't there need to be a big banger?
Yeah.
Like, technically, there was a question mark there.
Actually, I think I've used that one, so now I'm embarrassed.
Well, I mean, understandable. Like, there's so many, like, there's pro-life versions. If a baby is actually a part of a woman's body in the womb, then wouldn't that mean that a mother has 2 eyes and 4 eyes and 20 fingers? And what if she has a boy? Like, these kind of gotcha questions that are sometimes intended to provoke people. And I've used this too. We've all done this. Yeah. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants trying to figure out how to do this better. One thing that we do differently is we try to recognize, like, that turns people off so quickly because I think younger people can see it coming from a mile away. And they don't trust where you're taking them. They don't want, like, they feel like you're leading them somewhere, but they're not like on your team, right? They don't feel like they're on your team right now. They feel like they're on the opposite end. Like, I feel like we're on the same team towards truth, but they probably feel like we're on the opposite ends of the match. So they don't want to go there. And then we just kind of get stuck. And so we kind of try to encourage people, like, generally, unless you're in like a debate with podiums and stuff, avoid the arguments that end with question marks. Like, ask a lot of clarification questions. And then when it comes time to respond or to make your argument, just make your argument. End it with a period and invite them to respond. Like, okay, so like here's like my reaction to that. Here's like, I'm not quite convinced because of this thing, although I really like this thing that you said. Come back at me. Help me understand like what I might still be getting wrong. That distinction, I think, really helps.
Yeah, people don't like to be made the fool or played the fool.
Yes.
And I think at some point you cross over into that where they start feeling defensive. And once you pick up on that, you've probably lost that conversation or any productive thing coming from that.
My wife's in nursing school right now, and when she was doing her core classes, she had to read Socrates for the first time, or I mean Plato. You know, so she's reading these Socratic dialogues, and she was like, Socrates was a jerk.
Yeah,
she was like, I really don't like this guy because you can tell. So I mean, Socrates is kind of condescension. It's fun to read, but it's like he's clearly the cat playing with mice, and they know they're mice. And as soon as like that's happening, they're going to want to get out of there as soon as they can.
Yeah. And you know, part of being successful in sharing your faith and drawing people to think the right questions is really being wise. It is being able to read the room. It's able to see when you're probably pushing too hard and wait until another time, another occasion.
Yes.
And be preparing and let the Holy Spirit work ahead of you. That's always an important part. Well, Josh, we blitzed right through our 22 minutes today, as we often do, and we're not even halfway through our list. So we'll come back and talk about this more in our next episode. But folks, thank you so much for listening to us here at Life Talks, and I hope that we are triggering some things that you might want to consider. All of us really should know somebody and ought to be praying for somebody, even if it's a person without a name, but that you know you're going to come into contact with, and ask yourself, how should I engage them in such important topics and important conversations? And how can I let my light shine? How can I be salt in a world that desperately needs, you know, what the Bible tells us, without coming across in such a way that I do more damage than I do good? So I hope you'll be thinking about that, and hope you'll join us next time at Life Talks as we continue our conversation. Hope you'll share us on your social media and let other people know about Life Talks if you would. And so until next time, thanks for joining us here today at Life Talks.